Anxious people didn't get their needs met when they were small well. And that doesn't mean that your mom was not there. It means that maybe she was preoccupied or she was anxious. So the baby senses sometimes there's a person who's present with me and sometimes there isn't. And I can't trust that all the time. And so I have an internal feeling like someone might disappear, because that's what a baby feels when a parent is not present. So if you're being rejected and your gut's falling through the floor or your heart is in pain, that is sensational memory being awakened. 9 times out of 10, it's not about you. If the other person's behavior is not about you either. To make it about that other person is to limit yourself from really the core of what got awakened inside of you.
Anxious attachment is feeling like you're always one step away from being abandoned, even when there's no evidence to support that fear. When you hear that quote, what do you think about?
There's some truth to that. The fear of abandonment, or there's a sense that the ball is going to be dropped, because the hallmark of anxious attachment is built on inconsistency in early years with your primary caregiver. So you always feel like, something bad might happen, and that lives in your nervous system.
And this, I hear you talk about this concept that our ability to self-soothe as an adult is based on our caregiver's ability to soothe us in our first 18 months of life. And so just to clarify, for those first 18 months, in order to get that self-soothing, we almost look outwards.
Yeah, so as humans, we're not born with our parasympathetic nervous system fully developed. So we have more of what we call our sympathetic nervous system. So we can call out and cry for help. And our primary caregiver is a stand-in for our parasympathetic nervous system those early years until we continue developing. So our mother or primary caregiver's ability to be in their parasympathetic system and lend it to us so we can co-regulate and feel soothed is how we start to wire and develop our own ability to self-regulate later on. If we don't get enough of that co-regulation and soothing from our primary caregiver, self-regulation is very hard.
And is this where stuff like bad addictions, like drugs, sex, food, is that it's almost in a way we're outsourcing our soothing as an adult? Is that safe to say?
Yeah, like the ability to self-regulate is not as well developed because we didn't get that holding and that, that sense of calmness enough. So we will look towards other things to help us calm down. And often that might be outside of us and it might develop into a dependency or unfortunately an addiction.
So let's say that, so when we feel that little bit of abandonment, our bodies can kind of go into override and start to freak out. What are some techniques to self-soothe without outsourcing it? And try to find that soothing inside of us.
Yeah, so if it's really early, co-regulation, so soothing with another person is the best way, but our respiratory system is the one system in our body that we have control over when a lot of our automatic nervous system and other systems are in fight flight or in states that are feeling very terrified. So extending our exhales can trick our body back into a sense of safety. So that's really powerful because if we can do box breathing, but also really extend the exhales, our mind and our body that thinks that we're running from a bear or we're going to die will start to realize that we're not because our breathing is extended.
And something that I've heard you talk about too is this concept of the fact that your body reacts before your mind. And when I hear that, I think sometimes when our body reacts, our mind can almost interpret how our body's feeling and almost misinterpret the situation. Is that safe to say?
Yeah, I think I understand the question. I think that our body is constantly collecting information and streams of information are coming through and up in our body to our brain, and our brain is actually slower at processing things and will make up stories that aren't always accurate as to what is going on. And so sometimes we're feeling scared and we don't know what cued it, and we can make up a story as to what's really going on, but our body's just really feeling unsafe. So yeah, lots of times we get lost in the narrative or the story when that's not always accurately depicting what's going on inside.
And it's unfortunate because people can just repeat that story over and over and over again and then just find out maybe a week or two later that it was all in their head. And at that point, you're wasting precious days of your life, I feel like, right?
Yeah, I think it's hard, to get out of the cycle. The cycle can really trap you. I was working with a client recently and I was helping him realize that his nervous system was in fight flight. So all of his thoughts follow your nervous system. And so if you can start to be with your nervous system and know that it's in a particular state, know that it colors every lens of every thought. So if you're scared, all your thoughts will be scary. They might not be accurate. If you're feeling calm and you're in rest and digest or in expansion, all your thoughts will be kind of a little bit more positive. So our thoughts kind of correlate directly with our nervous system state. And it's just a big awareness to start to understand that.
Can it be almost like a vicious cycle of your mind reacting to your body and then just goes back and forth? Your body starts to get rile up because of the way you're thinking. Is that also a factor in it too? It kind of they both interlink. They both affect each other. They both increase the anxiety.
Absolutely. And I think we can get addicted to these cycles, and so they become patterns. For example, this one client that I was talking about, he was in a kind of turbulent relationship, and now that he's out of it, he's still cycling. So we have to work on kind of calming him down because we keep cycling. We can feed that cycle, but eventually what we want to do is break the pattern and start to realize, oh, my body is used to being in hypervigilance, or it's used to fear, or it's used to conflict. And so now it's still going to look for that in the external world because those are the hormones that are being released, and the cortisol and all of the adrenaline. And without those things constantly being released, we have to deal with other things. But we're just used to those cycles. And so getting out of those cycles, even when we're out of a situation that is, let's say, not great, we're still cycling in our nervous system and in our body. So it takes time to unpack that and get your system to really calm down.
Why do you said we're addicted to it? Why do you think we're addicted to it?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it's conscious or unconscious. Addicted is probably not the same word, the right word, but we become used to us, familiar. So sometimes the chaos becomes so familiar for us that without the chaos and without the cycle, we can feel into the void or other things that might come up, so that craziness and that cycle keeps us preoccupied and perhaps a little bit distracted around other things that we might not be ready to process or be with. But when we slow down and we get out of those cycles, then it gives us an opportunity to hold what might be underneath all of that distraction or chaos.
What exactly does anxious attachment mean? Because I feel like a lot of people have, especially nowadays, have the tendency to self-diagnose themselves before they actually know what the thing that they're self-diagnosing themselves with actually means. So what does anxious attachment actually mean?
Yeah, so I mean, attachment in general means embedded patterns, kind of embedded in our nervous system, in how we stayed in connection and survived early on, and how we brilliantly adapted in our system. And so for the hallmark for people who are more anxious, I would say is a level of inconsistency with their primary caregiver. And that doesn't mean that your mom was not there. It means that maybe she was preoccupied or she was anxious. So the baby senses sometimes there's a person who's present with me and sometimes there isn't. And I can't trust that all the time. And so I have an internal feeling like someone might disappear, because that's what a baby feels when a parent is not present. They're distracted or dysregulated themselves. And get it, every parent does this, but for an anxious baby, this, parents don't have to be perfect, but this is happening so often that the baby can't really trust in the connection. And so that's where you get, the hypervigilance or the abandonment fears, or the baby reaches out and starts to regulate the parent and be more in tune with what's going on with the parent. So there's a little bit of self-abandonment in order to survive. And so some of these really early adaptive strategies get hardwired into our somatic shape and our nervous system. And then when we're in romantic relationship later on, we attach and we use the same strategies when we're scared or when we're bonding. And so often they are founded in early ways of adapting. So I think just the hallmark for anxious, and it's hard to really put it into like a very condensed thing, but I would say is inconsistency.
So what I'm hearing is that if you have that inconsistency as a child with your primary guardian, there's glimpses of that inconsistency as an adult, you tend to more get triggered from that, correct?
Well, your somatic experience is I can't trust that the other person's going to be there. So you, whether real or imagined, might pick people who are inconsistent because that's what's familiar for you. And even if you pick people who are consistent, if they even blow in the direction of inconsistency, your system is going to sense danger because that was very threatening for you when you're small, and so your automatic nervous system will go into different states because you'll be scared. So it's really neuroception working there.
So as an adult, how is what does anxious attachment look like on a day-to-day basis?
It really depends. It depends on what relationships you have in your life. So if you have consistent, warm, nurturing relationships in your life, an anxious person will feel pretty secure. And if you have relationships that are inconsistent or constantly letting you down or aren't quote unquote safe, I use safe, lightly because really they're not safe. They're just not consistent. So they don't feel safe for an anxious person. Then they're going to get dysregulated and it's going to kick up some of the earlier fears. And I think the closer the relationship, the more important the relationship, the higher the stakes, for the anxious person.
What about avoidant? That's like the opposite spectrum of it. What does that mean if you're avoidant?
Yeah, anxious people can be avoidant too, avoidant of their abandonment wound. But avoidant people struggle in the same way because they detach from their emotional experience. And instead of running towards the thing that they're scared out of for co-regulation or connection, they tend to run away, and they are built much more on they tend to be more self-reliant and independent as a way to protect themselves. And they didn't get a lot of co-regulation at all or connection in that way when they were small. So they've given up a little bit emotionally, and they have a very hard time connecting to their needs and asking for their needs and identifying their feelings. And yeah, an anxious and avoidant tend to be attracted to each other, which I unpack a lot in my book.
Why is that?
Lost parts of themselves. Anxious people tend to see avoidant people as really independent and self-sufficient, which is something they idealize and want. And avoidant people can see that anxious are lively and full of emotion and emotionally free, which is something that they want. They tend to be more constricted and restricted. Both are in fear and surviving in different ways. And so they're kind of attracted to the ways in which the other is presenting.
I feel like if you have a relationship with an anxious person and an avoidant person, I almost feel like their behaviors can almost negatively impact each other sometimes in a way that when the avoidant person goes away, the anxious person can get riled up, which makes the avoidant person go away more. What do you think about that?
Absolutely. So both are in fear states. So an anxious person, in order to get out of fear, they will run towards and try to get into connection because they're consciously trying to avoid that abandonment wound, right? So they're going to run towards in fear. And we're telepathically telling our partner, I am scared, I'm running towards you. And the other person who's scared, who helps themselves, actually an avoidant person helps themselves by running away to kind of self-regulate, right? So one person needs connection or is desperate for connection to feel safer, and one person needs space in order to feel safer. So they, at the same time, they're both needing the opposite of what the other is able to provide.
How do we know which end we fall on, if we're anxious or avoidant? Is there ways that we can determine which side of that we're on?
Yeah, I mean, primarily when you're scared, do you get activated? Do you run towards? Do you people please? Do you have some of those hallmark waiting for the shoe to drop? Do you do better in connection versus being alone? Avoidant people, do you need a lot of space? Is it really hard for you when someone comes at you? Do you feel smothered? Do you feel like you're going to lose your sense of identity? So, asking yourself those kinds of questions, you can kind of see where you land. But we have every single attachment style stored in us. We just have a primary way of relating or dealing with these things. But let's say I'm, just a little bit anxious and you're more anxious than me. I might show up avoidant in our relationship. Or if you're really, really avoidant and I'm anxious, my dysregulated or fearful parts could come up. So we're constantly moving on a spectrum based on our own embedded patterns and the combination of another person's embedded patterns and the relational dance that that relationship takes up. That's why it's not always that black and white, and we're not really one label. In my next book, I'm going to talk about the attachment wheel and help people understand that we really do store many different types of relational experiences inside our nervous system.
So what I'm hearing is that it's almost something that can change. So let's say a couple of years ago, you're in a relationship and you're more of the anxious type in that relationship. And then you find a new relationship 2 years later and that person's a little more anxious. Doesn't that make you a little more avoidant in a way? Can it change from relationship to relationship?
Yeah, you can change in how you show up from relationship to relationship. You can also heal and change the relationships in which you feel magnetically drawn to. So a lot of that can happen.
So I took a test to determine my attachment style. It was just a random Google test. I'm not sure how accurate this is. But I was fearful, avoidant / disorganized. What does that mean?
Yeah, so you have patterns of both inside of you. And I can relate to that. Sometimes I'm anxious with avoidant protectors, but in one relationship, when I was in a relationship with someone who was really avoidant, I had disorganized fearful parts come up. And so I'm really scared to get close, but I'm also scared to be alone. So you're really trapped kind of in a state more often or not where you don't know where to be in relationship to another person. So it's the hardest one because it's a little bit more chaotic in that like nothing feels safe. And sometimes babies with disorganized, they had a parent that was not safe, but yet we still need that parent. We still need to connect, but we're also terrified of them. So it's this very conflicted state. I'd be surprised if you're disorganized all the time. Like I said, we have pockets sometimes of disorganized, and maybe if you partner with someone who's really anxious or really avoidant or disorganized, more disorganized parts of yourself would come up. But if you partnered with someone who's secure, you probably have less disorganization come up.
Can you elaborate on what disorganized looks like?
Yeah, what it feels like is I really desperately want connection, but I'm terrified of it at the same time. So I'm kind of stuck in my body. I want to run towards that person, but they don't feel safe, but I can't run away because I'm also scared. So I'm trapped in this state of fear and not really comfortable with connection, but also not comfortable without connection.
That makes a lot of sense. How accurate are these tests? Because I took this test, but who knows if that's my exact attachment style. So these tests online, how accurate are they, and what tests should we look into? Do you have anything maybe in your book or on a website?
I actually have an attachment style test that I can send to you afterwards. I would say they're pretty accurate. It's not that hard to find what category, but again, people get so stuck in the label, and you really can show up in more than a different attachment style depending on who you're attaching to. And I think it really helped me when I identified that I was anxiously attached. And now I'm writing about my disorganized parts and helping people to really understand that this is a whole circular system. This isn't just a label and a category that we stay stuck in. And we are in relationship with so many people who can bring up so many good things about us too. Like if I'm in a secure relationship, more of my secure parts are going to show up. So the label is important maybe to help you feel like you're not crazy and that there are other people and there's ways to heal, but the label is also really important to not get stuck in because we do move along a wheel. What's a misconception about anxious attachment that you would like to address to the world? Is there like a cliche or there's a misconception that people have that's just simply not true? I feel like anxious people always think that their avoidant partners should need to get the help. And I hear, because I've been that person before. But if you're listening, and I know how frustrating it is to be with someone who's avoidant, but anxious people are avoiding intimacy with themselves. So into me, I see. So being with the abandonment and the frustration and going inward and starting to work with that would actually provide more healing than trying to get somebody else to change. And so that was a big life lesson for me. And I think a very empowering place to be, actually, like gives you a sense of agency that I can heal at any time, no matter what my partner's behaviors are presenting. if they're bringing up pain and fear inside of me and discomfort, instead of blaming them, let me bring that to someone who can help me connect that to the original wound, and let me start healing so that I either can put up with my partner and their behaviors don't bother me so much, or that I attract someone who perhaps doesn't have those behaviors.
What does a healthy, secure relationship look like when it comes to attachments? If I had to guess, like this is kind of something you brought up, is that it's not like these attachment styles, when you get into a healthy relationship, it's not like they just disappear and everything's great. There's still going to be those little aspects of those of that anxious or avoidant. So what does a secure attachment look like?
Yeah, I mean, so it's hard to say because I think every relationship has its journey and hardships, but I would say the ability to rupture and repair is a good sign that you're in a healthy relationship. So it's not that we don't fight. It's that when we fight, we can come back to the table, build empathy, come back with some intimacy, get vulnerable, and repair and have a deepening. And so, relationships that don't make it are relationships that struggle with deep repair, intimacy, vulnerability, ownership, being able to look within in order to take accountability. Those earlier wounding makes it really hard. And then relationships that do make it, when there is conflict, the conflict ends up being a catalyst for a deepening in terms of connection and understanding each other. So I would say, the hallmark of how well you rupture and repair. And people with more insecure styles, they get dysregulated, and coming back to regulation, or like homeostasis, we call it, takes longer. So it just takes longer to get back into connection. And so relationships that can rupture and repair and get back into connection faster and have an inherent trust that even when I fight with my partner, or even when things are hard, we're not going anywhere, and we've proven over and over that we can get through really hard things together and build that resilience.
A question that came to my mind when you were saying that is, how do we know when it's time to repair versus end it? Because I feel like a lot of people, the one that's most common is staying in a relationship that can't be repaired, rather than leaving a relationship that could have actually survived.
Yeah, I mean, I personally stayed in a relationship for a very long time that there was a rupture that could not be repaired. And part of the problem was the repair wasn't possible. Like what the other person wanted, what didn't exist in reality, right? So kind of coming to terms with, like, is my partner being realistic around what they wanted, right? In this particular case, my partner wanted the past to not exist. So it wasn't a repair I could fix. So, a lot of circles around that. So understanding what really is the problem, what would cause a repair, building empathy, and then, how many times are we having the same fight? But often, like, couples come to me and they're having repeated fights, and then they do some work, like imago work with an imago therapist, and, or that's one that I would suggest, or emotionally focused couples therapist. Those are the two. And if you go and you get help from a professional that can really see what you're really fighting about and help you do a really authentic, you might just not have insight around, we're not really fighting about this, trying to understand what it is. I would say that's always worth a shot before you throw in the towel, because 9 times out of 10, couples don't really know what they're fighting about. They see it up here, and really it's about connection, or it's about their core wounds or things like that. So getting help, I'm always for repair. And even if you don't stay in the relationship, repair is always pretty valuable in itself, to understanding the other person and what's going on inside.
What's the role of friends and family in what you just said? Because I feel like when we go through little ruptures in our relationships, we tend to go to family and friends. And what I find and what I hear from other people is that a lot of times friends and family, they give you the advice that you want to hear and make you feel better, versus the hard actual truth that might be a little painful. So what's the role of friends and family in all of this?
Depends on the friend and the family. You remember, I think when we go and we complain about our partner, it's sticky, because, often family will take on your pain, or they will see you in pain and they want to maybe pour more gasoline or blame the other person. And remember, relationships are a two-way street. And, whenever we're complaining about our partner, we also want to say, like, what's my part in this? And so often friends and family aren't kind of confront you into, like, what your part is in it. And it can also be damaging to the relationship. So if you're complaining to a family member that also sees your partner, you're changing their perspective of them. So it's nice to have someone who's outside of your system help you. And I know that when people come to me and they complain about someone in their life, I hold space for them and I don't contribute to the pain. You know what I mean? So you don't want to try to fix the person. You don't want to give them a solution. You just want to hold the space, which can be really frustrating when you see someone doing the same thing over and over and over again. And there's an obvious dance going on, but still it's everybody's own individual journey through the relationship dynamics to make the changes or get the help when they need it.
So let's say we're really good friends, and I'm right now I'm freaking out over a dating situation, and my parasympathetic nervous system's going crazy, and I call you. What would your approach be to get me to calm down and look at it more?
It would be your sympathetic. Yeah, it would be your sympathetic nervous system. So part of it, I would just be holding and listening, to what's going on in you, and maybe even repeating what I hear and like trying to be as calm as possible. Other than that, I would have to hear the actual situation, but I'm a therapist, so I might tie it back if you're my friend to like, it kind of sounds like this person's like kicking up some mom issues or something like that. Like there might be something deeper going on here for you. I wonder, I wonder what's going on a deeper level that's being awakened right now inside of you.
A big label that people put on people that are anxiously attached is needy. And something I've heard you say is that it's not that they're needy, they're scared. Do you mind breaking that down a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, two things. I think that, when we're scared, anxious people reach out. And so that in that fear, it can be perceived as needy or needing extra reassurance. And anxious people didn't get their needs met when they were small. So the fear of not getting their needs met is there, and getting their emotional needs met is needed as an adult. Whatever we don't get when we're small, we have to re-experience and get when we're an adult. So choosing people, whether it's a therapist, a coach, a sponsor, who can actually meet these emotional needs and provide some consistency that they didn't get when they were small actually repairs the nervous system and starts to help an anxious person understand that what needing this much is okay. And that's what you needed when you were small and you didn't get it. And now we have to find people who have the capacity to meet these needs. And there's nothing wrong with that. And the more that we're in the presence of people who have the capacity to meet our needs, the more we don't need, right? Like, so it's like the more we calm down and we're like, so I have a friend who has always showed up for me. His name's Alan, and always been there for me. And, I don't need him as much anymore, but I know the second I needed him, he's there because he's been there for me so consistently throughout the years that my system has internalized the sense of security that he's there for me. But it took me needing him for a while and him proving that he's available enough for my system to trust, oh my God, he's a secure anchor for me. So the more that we lean on dependable people, the more our system starts to redefine what our somatic experience was before to a new somatic shape of I actually can depend on people and the right people can show up for me. And the more I do that, the less I need, the more interdependent I become.
So what I'm hearing is that you can be needy without being needy without being anxious can almost be healthy in a way. Is that what I'm hearing?
Well, being needy and being anxious is okay. And there are people who have bigger capacities to hold that. And if you're going to people who didn't, it probably is familiar from your childhood home, and finding people who have capacity to not feel smothered or hold that or be consistent for you. I wish there was more of these people on this earth, because that's what we need to heal. We need secure, dependable people to hold us, right? So this is what a baby needs from its parent. It needs to have inherent trust that our needs are going to get met over and over and over again. So when they don't get that, the somatic shape is I'm not going to get my needs met. So that we need to relearn that we can depend on people as an adult, pick the right people, and our system starts to learn, okay, it is safe to trust. I can internalize this person. So we internalize our parents, whether they're inconsistent or not, and we also internalize people in our lives. So if we start to internalize, like for example, my friend, I leaned on him a lot, and then I internalized his felt sense of his presence being there for me, which is what a baby does, a secure baby does. And then I feel safe in the world because I know he's with me. He gets internalized, and I can reach out and he's going to respond in a timely manner. That's how we build inner security when we haven't internalized the most secure parents when we're small. I hope that makes sense. I know it's a little bit complicated.
No, at all. And what's your, there's a lot of online and just like advice for dating for men. I feel like they're pushing us towards the avoidance side, being like, you need to be cold, you need to not show your true feelings. What do you think about that message for men, that they can't be needy and that they need to? I could tell by your face when I said that.
Well, I mean, it's so layered, you know. I mean, I think some women say they want vulnerable men, but they haven't done a lot of work. So men coming or showing that they're vulnerable scares them, or they don't know, they don't know how to handle it. But men struggle with this just as much as women, and unfortunately it's more okay for a woman to be emotional or needy, and it's less okay for a man, and so they suffer even more than women. And it's just sad so if you're out there and you're a little bit more on the needy side, you want to look for, and you're a male, you want to look for a more secure woman. And so if you express your needs and get vulnerable and she can't handle them, she's not for you. And so the right woman won't be scared away. Obviously, when you're building new relationship, you don't want to come off. You slowly want to integrate and build trust and get to know someone in your own pace. But I think if you're vulnerable and you express like, "Hey, I'm scared" or something going on, and it's not received well, then that person is probably not your person. Transparency, I think, is really a faster way to getting you to someone who's more compatible for you exactly where you're at. And you don't need to be in any specific place to be in a relationship. Relationships can be healing at any level.
Yeah, something that I believe in is that I feel like a lot of people try to attract every single person in the world without actually trying to attract the right people. And when they go through a rejection with the wrong person, they can almost internalize that as they suck, when the reality is that might have just been the wrong person.
Yeah, or there might be, part of that rejection for them to look at, or 9 times out of 10, it's not about you. If the other person's behavior is not about you either. I mean, this is something I had to learn the hard way. It's like, I've been in a relationship before where the other person's behavior is bizarre and off track and just really out there, and they're making it about me, but it's really about their fear and what's going on inside their inner world. And it's really hard to not personalize other people's behaviors, but 9 times out of 10, it's just really not about you.
So, but what if it is that 10th time and it actually is your fault? Because I feel like a lot of times it's so easy to point the finger at the other person, and that kind of robs you of taking that internal reflection on yourself and seeing what you did wrong.
Right. Yeah. No. And I think sometimes I wouldn't say it's your fault or not. I would say that if you expressing yourself or having a behavior that wasn't seen in a positive light, or maybe push the other person away, you're just being human. But starting to understand why that behavior is there, like what's at the core of that behavior, might be, a pathway into doing some of your own healing work. So if you meet someone and you have a pattern of meeting someone and then, getting to a place where then you are texting excessively, right? There's nothing wrong with that behavior, but that behavior might drive another person away repeatedly over and over again. So like you could shame yourself all day long about the behavior of texting excessively, or you can say there must be some fear in me that comes up when I get to a certain place in a relationship, and I need to hold and be with that fear and bring that fear to someone who can help me understand what gets activated in me, what's being awakened in me that I get so scared, and can I start to be with it and heal it and be compassionate around the behaviors that I have around it, right? It's never about shaming our behaviors.
I think this is so important for people to hear, because especially, I mean, this can apply to both genders, but I feel like especially young men, they date a girl and then they're a little too needy or they're a little too much, and then that person rejects them or abandons them, and then they internalize that as, oh, I can't be needy. And what you're saying is that maybe that's just not the right person for you.
Yeah, and if they're rejecting you and that abandonment comes up and it feels really sensational in your body and really rocks your world, that's not about that person. That's a memory, and that's early developmental trauma being activated or attachment wounds being activated. That's a great spot to go see someone and start to heal, because person X, I promise you, did not create that. If it's living big in your body, we got implicit stored memories or embedded trauma going on. And so to make it about that other person is to limit yourself from really the core of what got awakened inside of you.
And I think a big issue with that is that, yes, there's childhood trauma that you remember, but a lot of it you don't. And so you can't really go back to that when you're in those moments and say like, oh, this is why I'm acting like this, because you just simply don't remember it.
If it's sensational, it's memory. And so we don't store explicit memories like, oh, I have a movie going on in my brain. We store sensation before we even have the ability to store regular, what people think of
in our
memory.
bodies, right? We store
in our bodies. So our gut and our heart and our fascia, our muscles. So if you're being rejected and your gut's falling to the floor, or your heart is in pain, that is sensational memory being awakened. So we know that that's developmental trauma. And I think that's like one of the biggest concepts I'm trying to get there out in the world, is that sensation is connected. Big sensation is connected to developmental attachment wounds or trauma. And if we blame person X for what we're experiencing in our body, we're missing like huge opportunity to be healing what's going on in our body. And we can stay in these patterns forever if we don't start to say, oh, memory is being awakened here. And now we have to start to see if it's sensational, 0 to 4. Even though we're always storing sensational memory, but we don't have explicit memory until about the age of 4. We only store sensational memory. And by the way, the bigger the sensation, usually the earlier the wound.
I feel like people lose themselves a lot, like in relationships, more than stuff like work. And is it safe to say that that's because of that deep trauma? It has a relationship trauma. I feel like it's a lot more deep than stuff like career stress. It's a lot more like personal. And that's why we can kind of lose ourselves where we're almost like oblivious and we just go crazy in a relationship. I feel like we tend to do that a lot more than, let's say, we're stressed at work.
I mean, I think it's two different things, but we can become workaholics, and our relationship with work can become a protector. In a way that we are avoiding our own experience. But if we're losing ourselves in relationship and that becomes all consuming, there's earlier wounding there that's happening. And it's normal to lose yourself a little bit in relationship because there's a merging that happens in the beginning of a relationship, but then you individuate again later in relationship. So there's so many layers to that. And I actually think people lose themselves. I lost myself to work over relationships for a period of my life until both. So both will be protecting me from my internal pain or our false sense of safety from probably my original trauma. So I became a workaholic. I didn't realize I was avoiding a lot within. And then I've gotten into relationships that help me feel better momentarily, but over a period of time, we still have our underlying issues and trauma that kind of like rears its ugly head. And you think that you've escaped from, but you never really escape it until you hold it and heal it. And you need a tremendous amount of safety in another person and in an environment to really do the deep healing.
So what I'm hearing is that not only can that childhood trauma affect your relationships, it can also affect your work. And like you said with you, it made you a workaholic. And it could also, I feel like people can be obsessed with their work to almost fill in a gap from their childhood about not feeling good enough or try to get that consistency that they think is going to come through success.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I needed work, and thank God I had it, because I didn't have the ability to heal what I was needing to heal at the time. So work was a protector for me. And we also live in a world or a culture that really pushes that, busy or being successful is going to, get you some kind of happiness, which is not true. But I tend to look at like, thank God I had work, because I didn't have a therapist at the time and I didn't have the knowledge of what I really needed or the space to really slow down and heal in the way that I didn't. So work just helped me protect me from what I wasn't ready to face. So a lot of people I was unconscious of that until I became conscious. Oh my God, like I needed that protector. And drugs, sex, work, shopping, beauty, like all of that is the whole thing. Certain things are okay, but when we start to use them as avoidance strategies because we don't have the safety to slow down and heal, they just become a way from us protecting ourselves from our internal pain. And I think the big goal would be to become conscious of, why am I working all these hours? What is the fear that's driving the behavior? What happens when I slow down and I start to be more present with my body? And am I too scared? And if you're scared, that's when you really need another person's nervous system to lend its calm state to you to start to unpack why you're avoiding the pain within.
So there's that trauma from our childhood that we may or may not remember from when we were younger, but then there's also that relationship trauma that can happen as an adult. How do we heal a past relationship trauma if it's getting in our way of possibly meeting new people or a relationship that we're currently in?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people don't realize that the relationship trauma as an adult is also developmental trauma, because if we were raised in a more secure home, we would attract more secure people. Not always, but there's a high probability that we're attracting people that are relatively around the same developmental wounding as us. So people want to say, no, I had no childhood trauma, but I dated this person and they gave me all my trauma, and you're not in touch with your embedded trauma, and there's a good chance there's more to that story, and there might be a fair amount of denial there. Not all the time, but if there's a lot of sensations going on in the body, we know there's a lot more that meets the eye. So I think that the average person protects themselves by not understanding that, like, there was more trauma in their earlier years. And trauma is like such a big word, and trauma can just be like your parent was preoccupied and busy and not attentive and not present with you enough and not reflecting your inner world enough and not helping you stay connected to yourself and building your secure sense of self. So trauma is just, unfortunately, steers people away. And I kind of forgot what the original question was, but if you have, like, I had something really bad happen to me in my adult life, like a huge betrayal. But because I understand interpersonal neurobiology, I'm not excusing his behavior, but I understand that his behavior was what he needed to do to survive. And I'm able to see, how it impacted me. And it was a betrayal, but I'm also able to see, like, his survival skills or adapted survival protectors are so severe that cheating is part of his pattern. Like, we start to understand, like, this isn't about me. This person has a pattern, and they have their own work to do, and they are just surviving in the world. And it's my job to separate what they're doing to me and start to see that, truly they are suffering as well. You kind of start to see both sides of the coin.
I feel like it's important to bring up too is that mindset that you just said of it's not my fault, it's something that they were dealing with. You don't really, I feel like it's very hard to feel that in those first initial weeks and months when you're just in that parasympathetic state of just anxiety and not really thinking straight. And that was a fascinating perspective that I've never heard before, is that trauma in relationships as an adult is still developmental. That's fast. I've never heard that.
Not always.
Okay.
But typically people who are raised and have more of a secure base tend to attract more secure people, unfortunately, and insecure types tend to attract. We tend to repeat our somatic trauma in our relationships, and we tend to have like telly as to who is alluring, and we tend to kind of do that. And I feel that we do that in order to heal it, but many people don't get conscious, so they just repeat it and repeat it and repeat it. I mean, you see this with narcissism a lot, the narcissistic wound. It's so hard to heal that wound, so they just jump from relationship to relationship to relationship, and they're just surviving, right? And so it's so much less about judging and so much more about like how we were wounded early on and how we try to survive and avoid those wounds in relationship. And I think having more compassion that, all of these things are happening. We just want to quickly put so much blame on other people when 9 times out of 10, they're just suffering and trying to survive as well.
What do you think are the biggest issues that Gen Z is having with dating? Because there's some troubling statistics with dating in Gen Z. What do you think are the biggest things that we're struggling with?
I think the transactional nature of being online is hard. I think there's so many options and people are just swiping. And I think, I don't know the dating world that much, but I think it's like almost like, online dating was such a blessing and it helped so many people. And now I feel like there's so many people who are using it addictively or not really interested in a deep romantic relationship, but are kind of addicted. I hate to say the word, but like using it as a form of protection. Like I'm just going to engage with this person and never really meet them, or I get the high off of these beginnings, or I don't know. There's so many different kind of problems that are arising with this platform. It's like anything else. Like I think there's its pluses. I know many people who have met online, and then I think having that much availability and that much transactional, like for over a picture and a few words, it's like missing a level of intimacy. It's just hard. It's hard, and it's easy to just reject people now because there's just another one waiting right behind, and so people aren't, giving relationships really a chance.
And I feel like it's never been easier to get that beginning, right? You mentioned like people are addicted to that beginning. With these apps, it's so easy just to find another beginning, right?
Yeah, I mean, depending on where you are, but yeah, like the people who are kind of more allured towards the honeymoon phase of the relationship, they're getting a lot of beginnings, right? And it's never kind of moving into the full relationship stages. They're just kind of dopamine honeymoon to next honeymoon to next honeymoon to next honeymoon. And that's not, longevity or deepening in any kind of one partnership, And maybe some people, I've had a client tell me that's all I want to do, because I only like the beginning stages of a relationship. But that's, the idea of what people want usually is a partnership for life and someone they can grow and evolve with. And these apps are making it harder and harder, or easier and easier to stay kind of dating in those earlier stages.
I feel like our low attention span doesn't help with that either, because the second that the relationship gets hard or we don't get that dopamine that we got from the beginning, it's so easy especially you add that with the fact that it's so accessible. No wonder why people are just going to the next. It's a hard problem. And I think we're seeing a trend of young people getting married a little later. And I think that consistency of staying with the same person might come with some maturity, especially since nowadays we're just so on to the next.
Yeah, no, I would agree with you. And I think it takes a long time to really know someone. Like I think you can go on a few dates with someone and, there's, depending on, again, where your wounding is, someone with an earlier wounding will want to merge and they'll idealize and they'll go into limerence a lot sooner. And someone with later wounding would go slower. And I say, if you're listening to this and you identify as having anxious attachment or even avoidant attachment, or if you're listening to this and you're secure, go slow as possible. If dopamine is flooding your brain, know that that's going to end, and to slow it down so you can get out of the dopamine phase and still see if you like this person, because the rose-colored glasses do come off. And pass that new person by some friends. If you're unsure, give them a lot of chances. Like you don't have to commit one way or another. You're allowed to collect data for a while. And that's really all you're doing in the beginning, is collecting information, seeing how the connection feels, and take your time, which is a mistake that I've made in the past, is not taking my time. I think we've all been there, right?
Yeah. What's the biggest misconception that young people have about being an adult?
I think that I thought being an adult, things get easier. And while they do, they didn't get easier the way that I thought. There's still hard days. There are still days where my little girl is struggling or wanting to throw a tantrum or crying or a bad day. Like, we don't just become an adult and change. We bring our small parts with us and life keeps unfolding. And so, yeah, I think I had this delusion that you reach adulthood and like life is easier and you have it all figured out. And it's like, I don't think we ever have it all figured out. I just don't think we do.
That's a very common theme when I ask that question, is people usually say something of that it's not, they don't have their stuff together or that they have everything figured out. So that tends to be a common thing that I hear. If you had a minute with your younger self, what would you tell her?
Oh God. I would tell her that her relationships are everything and to find safe people and not to work as hard, that she is deserving of love and success just by being who she is. And yeah, I don't know. I've had a hard path, but I don't know that I would change any of it. I actually embrace all my lessons. So I would tell her that it gets easier in your 40s. And you're going to have peaks and valleys, and that's just part of it.